Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here today, and it's going to be an exciting conversation, and I'm sure you're going to have a great time. I am Ana Julia Hatar, President of the Venezuelan American Association of the US, and I would like to give a special welcome to Elliot Abrams, Special Representative for Venezuela at the US State Department, and he will be speaking on the United States and Venezuela. I'm also very pleased that there are so many members and friends that are joining us like in this very moment. And I would like to give a heartfelt thanks to Mr. Abrams for taking his time to be with us, and to our Vice President and great friend, Michael Skoll, who as interviewer will guide the discussion. The Venezuelan American Association, for those who don't know, has been promoting interchange between Venezuela and the US for over 80 years. And during this unprecedented crisis, VAUS has been diligent in bringing awareness and utilizing this platform to foster discussion and spark action like today. I now would like to introduce my great friend, Mike Skoll, the Vice President of VAUS. He's principal at Skoll and Cerna at the U.S. Colombian Consortium, providing counter money laundering and anti-corruption services for governments, multinational institutions, and private firms. He served 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, including being ambassador to Venezuela for a while before the Chavez times. So I might add that he also has been working with us to bring democracy back to Venezuela. Thank you, Mike, for your work. And thank you a lot, Mr. Elliot Abrams, for your time today. So now, Mike, you take over. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ana Julia. It really is a special pleasure to have Elliot Abrams here today. You all have his bio. It's not necessary to repeat it. He was an Assistant Secretary of State during the Reagan administration, National Security Council under the second push. He's been deeply involved in Latin America, Middle Eastern, and human rights issues. And I just have to say that he's the toughest person I could think of to confront Maduro, Castro, and the Ayatollah all at once. Let me remind you that this is a talk that is, quote, not for attribution, unquote, the so-called Chatham House rule. Participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers, nor that of any other participant may be revealed. Violators will be sanctioned. Later on, during the talk or right afterwards, you can ask questions. Just touch the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, type up your question, and then at the proper time, I will read the question to Mr. Abrams. So, Elliot, welcome. You've been on this job for almost 17 months. 14 months, more or less, since the events or non-events of April 30th, 2019. Where do we stand now?
Thanks, Mike. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank Ana Julia, and I want to thank you for the invitation. People listening may have gleaned, you and I have known each other literally for decades from the time, actually, when you were ambassador and before you were ambassador, when we were colleagues in the Department of State. Where are we? Well, we're not where we'd like to be, in the sense that we would like to see democracy return to Venezuela. We continue the policy of supporting the last democratic institution in Venezuela, the National Assembly, supporting Juan Guaido, its elected president, and supporting him as interim president of Venezuela. We continue the policy of being part of a 58-nation coalition that respects and supports Guaido and supports democracy in Venezuela. we continue to apply our sanctions, which grow really every month as targets appear. We continue to oppose the actions of the Maduro regime, which are diminishing the political space, including the most recent actions, diminishing the political space. Restoring democracy to Venezuela, which is fundamentally, the goal of most Venezuelans, is proving to be very difficult. It's proving to be very difficult for a number of reasons. One is that the regime has some outside support. Cuba, Russia, Iran, most recently, some others, Turkey, I think you could say, but primarily Cuba, Russia, and most recently, Iran. I think we've also found that the regime is fighting harder to stay in power than many other dictatorial regimes in Latin America did. You and I remember very well the days in the 1980s, really starting with the Carter administration, then the Reagan administration, when at the beginning, most Latin American countries had dictatorships in power, and one by one, through negotiations, they left. These were mostly right-wing military juntas, and it was possible to negotiate them out of power. I don't mean for us to do that, but for democratic forces in those countries. I think the problem here is that this regime, first of all, is not a right-wing military dictatorship, which might be more susceptible to US pressure. It's really a gangster regime. And the people at the top of the regime are so involved in criminal activity, which is why we indicted Nicolas Maduro, among others, that they're going to fight until the very last day. And that obviously makes it harder. We have no doubt about the outcome, but we wish that the timing were a lot quicker.
So, part of the problem then is too many committed Cubans and too many compromised generals?
Yeah, I would say the Cubans, in our view, the Cubans have about 2,500 intelligence agents.
You mean doctors, don't you?
No, let's, pardon me, let's distinguish. I think there are something like 30,000 Cubans in Venezuela. The greater numbers are doctors and teachers, and some of them are, honest and hardworking people who would like democracy in Venezuela and in Cuba. Many of them, on the other hand, clearly report in what they're seeing in Venezuela and are part of the Cuban regime's program in Venezuela for political control. About 2,500 are straight intelligence agents. And their main job is to spy on the rest of the Venezuelan regime, and particularly the military. People say, how come there hasn't been a military uprising against this regime? And if you want a 4-letter word answer to that, it's Cuba. Because people in the military know, if you say you're a colonel, you're a captain, you say to another colonel or captain, Maduro is destroying this country. We ought to do something about it. You are likely to be killed or to end up in jail. And this has happened. We remember last summer, the Navy captain, Costa Revelo, who was murdered, who was tortured to death. So I think that's the Cubans. Now, for the regime itself, there are many in the high command who are totally compromised by, for example, making deals with drug traffickers. The drug route, is from Colombia, substantially, from Colombia into Venezuela and then north. Well, how come those little planes coming out of Venezuela aren't stopped by the Venezuelan regime or the Venezuelan military? The answer is simple: payoffs.
Well, what do you do about the fact that there are so many generals and other high-ranking officials in the country? You want them all to leave. You might think we or someone could find them a place to go to, but they're all rightly fearful of being prosecuted, extradited, killed. There's just so many of them. I mean, frankly, if I were God forbid, Venezuelan general, I would say to you or to anyone else, how can you possibly guarantee that I will be able to go with my family to Spain or Argentina or Paraguay and not immediately be extradited or indicted by, if not the United States, then any one of a number of countries. What's the number? 57 that now support Guaido? What would you say to me?
I'd say a couple of things. First, in every transition that has taken place away from a dictatorship in Latin America and Eastern Europe and South Africa, there's been some kind of amnesty, and it's always negotiated. If you look at the framework for a democratic transition that the United States proposed on March 31st, we actually suggested that during a transition, the military leadership stay in place. And we've been criticized for this because we've indicted some of them. We've sanctioned others. So what do you mean leave them in place? Well, you know, we're trying to be realistic. An elected government, a democratic government, should presumably change the military leadership, but not during the transition. And we also favor, obviously, a negotiated agreement. And one of the parties that's going to have to be active in any kind of national negotiation in Venezuela is the military. We also say to people in the military, look, the number of people in the military who've been indicted or sanctioned is quite small. Over time, it will grow. And the number of Venezuelans who are willing to actually take to the streets now is also likely to grow. If you think of Panama or you think of Haiti, the military there waited and waited and waited to act. And the outcome for those institutions was very bad. The institution was essentially gutted. You don't want that to happen to the institution in Venezuela. Act sooner, not later. Now, so far, it hasn't persuaded them. But you can't really, the ability to predict when that will happen is very poor. And you go back and look at the record of people who said, I mean, Hillary Clinton, for example, the situation in Egypt is stable. How many people predicted when the Soviet Union would collapse? Our ability to predict these things is poor or not so great, yet they happen.
It's rather remarkable that U.S. policy toward Venezuela is one of the few foreign policies of the United States that has very broad bipartisan support. We saw it at the State of the Union. To me, it's extraordinary because this is not exactly a bipartisan era in U.S. foreign policy or anything else. What does that mean for the policy going forward?
Well, you're right. It's pretty rare, and it's great. And we try to maintain it, and I've found, I mean, these face-to-face meetings are not held now because of the pandemic, but when I used to go up to the Hill and meet with the Democratic leaders in the House or the Senate or the Foreign Relations Committees, we didn't argue. We just talked about what U.S. policy was and directions to move in. I think it's, pardon me, I think it's a message it should be a message to the Maduro regime. I do think they're thinking a lot about November. And I do think they're hoping, well, the Trump administration is very hard on us, but you'll see when Biden gets in, it'll all change. If you notice the tweet that the Vice President Biden made, I think it was Sunday, very tough tweet against the Maduro regime and against dictatorship. And again, we've tried to send the message in various ways. What you just said is right. This is a bipartisan policy. And were there a change in January, you could see a lot of areas where policy would change a lot. I don't think that's true of Venezuela. And we've got lots of statements from the leaders of both parties in Congress, and as you said, during the State of the Union. So I think it ought to be a strong message to this regime that you're going to have the same policy. You think sanctions are going to disappear should the Democrats win? You're wrong.
Very good. Let's get this over with. What's your reaction to John Bolton's book, especially the chapter on Venezuela, which I understand has been circulating all over Venezuela and a lot of other places? Bolton did praise you, as you know. Of course, he criticized the president and Mnuchin. Listen, you don't have to answer, but I know you'd love to.
No, what can I say? Of course, I haven't read the book, have read the chapter. First, I wrote a memoir of my 4 years, of my 8 years in the George W. Bush administration, but it appeared about 4 years later.
You're frozen at the moment. Elliot, why don't you reconnect?
Okay, let me just, can you hear me now?
You're all right now, yeah.
Okay. I wrote a memoir, but it came out 4 years after the administration. And I've been very critical of people who write while the president they served is still in office. And there are many of them. Bolton's not the first. But I think that's a very bad practice. I think, you know, the description of the debate within the administration in early 2019 shouldn't surprise anybody. It was an extraordinary event when the world said the 2018 election was not acceptable, and we were going to recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Was there a debate about this? Sure there was. But the policy was set in January 2019. The policy continues. It is a bipartisan support. There is bipartisan support for that policy, and that is not going to change.
In many ways, the policy toward Venezuela is also a policy toward Cuba. It's a policy toward Iran. How do you explain or the linkage among the three? I assume that you are talking with some frequency with our special representative on Iran in the State Department, for example. Is this also not an opportunity for those who would like to see harsher actions against Cuba linked to a policy on Venezuela, which is popular and bipartisan?
Yes, I'd say first on Cuba, why do they care about Venezuela? I think for two reasons. First, ideological. And second, because they want the oil. And, you know, they've been getting free or cut rate oil, first from Chavez, now from Maduro, and they really need it. There were some people, and I would say Canada is an example of this, who thought, you know, let's talk Turkey to the Cubans and say, well, what do you want? You know, you need oil? Okay, maybe we could organize something with, who knows, Mexico and Qatar, and, you know, to guarantee you oil for 10 years. And then maybe you play a better role in Venezuela. No dice, because there is a huge ideological element. I can't say what the Cuban regime would do if Raul Castro were not alive and in charge, but he is alive and he is in charge, and making sure that it's a highly ideological policy of supporting this regime. So there's no give in the Cuban policy. And people who think, well, you know, talk nicely to them and they'll forget it. It's not happening. In the case of Iran, they've got a lot of gasoline to sell because demand is down. And Maduro has gold, and they want the gold. So, the two sides have come together. And needless to say, neither in the case of Cuba nor Iran nor Russia do they care in the slightest about democracy or human rights in Venezuela, the rights of the Venezuelan people. So they're good partners for Maduro. They don't ask him about, human rights challenges inside the country or what the Venezuelan people want. We have, through our sanctions, largely ensured that no one will trade for Venezuelan oil except Iran at this point. That is, the Russians have pulled back, the Chinese have pulled back. So Maduro looks around. Is there a pariah state out there that will actually trade with me? And the answer seems to be, yeah, Iran. And they've kind of stepped up to the plate. We have ensured most recently that no other ships will carry that trade except Iranian ships. Again, Rosneft left. The Russian ships are not doing it. The Chinese ships are not doing it. And most recently, the Greek Shipowners Association said, we're not going to do that. So it's a partnership between vicious and brutal pariah states.
What's next? I assume there are more sanctions to come, more indictments, actions on the high seas against Iranian tankers.
Well, I would say first, I've been hearing for, it's almost a year and a half.
You have frozen again.
Am I back at this point?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, funny that happens, but
it's the Cubans, Elliot. I happen to know that.
It could be the Chinese, but we can have that discussion later. There are, as people engage, as and if they engage in this trade, we sanction them, and then they pull out. That's what happened to Rosneft, most recently with a bunch of Greek-owned ships. In fact, there were 4 ships that were heading for Venezuela, carrying gasoline from Iran. We imposed sanctions, and they stopped in the sea and turned around. So we will continue to do that. And as people tell us about commerce with Venezuela that's illicit, I should say illicit meaning not humanitarian. Our sanctions don't cover food and medicine. That's a different story. But if they're not in the humanitarian commerce, we will sanction them.
On sanctions, is it not true that even if Maduro doesn't fall immediately, there are benefits from sanctioning countries like Venezuela and indirectly countries like Cuba in terms of their projection of terrorism, drug trafficking, their ability to do mischief or worse beyond their shores. In other words, sanctions are more than an attempt to dislodge Maduro and
company. Yes, they're an attempt, for example, to prevent the Maduro regime from doing something it's been doing for a long time, hosting the ELN and the FARC and Colombian drug traffickers in Venezuela. They're an effort to prevent Maduro from being a power in the region. You remember that what was called Petrocaribe, which gave cut rate oil to a lot of countries in the Caribbean and gave Maduro a lot of political clout in the Caribbean. They're an effort to prevent bad actors like Cuba and Iran from being in Venezuela. And they're an effort more generally just to prevent Maduro, again, from not just in the Caribbean, but from all of Latin America, from exercising influence.
let me suggest that things are getting even worse in Venezuela rather than getting better. Just very recently, Maduro and company took over the electoral tribunal. The opposition parties, I just can't imagine that Cap must be turning rapidly over in his grave, imagining Maduro in charge of Acción Democrática. So things are going in the opposite direction inside Venezuela.
The most recent things that you point out are among the worst, but perhaps the worst is something that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has mentioned in her report: murders, which are now up to about 8,000 extrajudicial killings by the police special forces, the FAES. The trend is bad. You know, generally speaking, we say somebody who could win a free election will hold a free election. And the fact that Maduro is closing the political space may be a reaction to the fact that he knows his popularity is so far down. The people of Venezuela want him out. So how do you react to that? You make sure that the political space is closed. You make sure the opposition has even less opportunity. The question, I think, in Venezuela is going to be, how does the society, by which I mean all parts, labor, business, the church, NGOs, civil society broadly defined, as well as the political parties, and to this, how do they organize to resist it? There is today, just as an example, a meeting of the so-called International Contact Group, which has the EU and European countries, Latin countries. They're going to be discussing how they react to what's happening in Venezuela. But there's no question that I think that Maduro feels himself to be under very considerable pressure, and this is how he has reacted.
The National Assembly elections in December, what's the import of that?
Well, there was real debate. There were even some real negotiations, serious negotiations, over putting together an elections commission that would truly represent all sides, that would have, the debate was, you know, have two people representing the Chavista party, the PSUV, two people representing the opposition, and a fifth would be a neutral. You know, a professor, for example, a former official, who both sides viewed as a pretty decent man or woman. And the regime just short-circuited all that and said, the hell with that, we're going to appoint our people. And they did. What you learn from that is there is not going to be a free election. They have no intention of risking a free election because, as you recall, the last parliamentary free election was 2015, and it gave a huge majority to the opposition. That is not a risk that Maduro seems willing to take. And he is willing, I think, to hold elections that every democracy in the world says are a fraud. So the, the prediction I think we can make today, unless something changes, he will hold elections in December. Most of the opposition, perhaps all of the opposition, will not participate. And democracies around the world are going to say, that's not a free election. They're not even going to send observers because sending observers means that you believe there is a level of fairness in the election. Sure doesn't look that way. There are also huge practical problems with his ability to hold a free election. Start with the pandemic. Are there in Venezuela now? None. So where would you get reliable voting machines? We think that even if you put aside the question of migrants and refugees, millions of Venezuelans have moved in the last 5 years. How will they register? Does Maduro, is he going to permit them to register? These are huge problems, even if you wanted to have a free election, but he clearly does not intend to permit one.
Okay, let's turn to questions from our audience. Once again, if you click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and then type your question, I will read them. Okay, number one. Oh, you see, here's a question about. I'll read the question, but you've already answered it. What's your stance on Bolton's book as a person that works on the high end of the government? Do you think he should have delayed the publication of his book? I'll paraphrase your answer of about 20 minutes ago. No.
Right. He should have delayed. He should have delayed until the end of the Trump administration, whenever that is.
Okay. Here's a question from Danielle Di Martino. Why would any member of the Maduro regime even consider any of the proposals put by the State Department when sanctions obviously haven't been enough leverage since they can keep reaping the gains of their criminal activity through money laundering and such?
Yeah, you know, I think their ability to do that has diminished. If you think of regime revenue prior to our sanctions, you know, at one point they're selling 3.5 million barrels a day under Chavez of oil. When the sanctions start, it's about 1 million barrels a day. We think now they're actually exporting not even half that. And of course, oil prices are way down. So if you try to calculate regime income, it's way down, which means the spoils to distribute within the system are also way down. So we think, you know, you have to calculate. You think Nicolas Maduro is going to be president for life? If you don't think that, then if you are associated somehow with the regime or you're in the military, how do you figure out a soft landing? They've got to be thinking about that.
Okay, here's a question from Pedro Borelli. If you say this is different than other dictatorships because of the criminality of the senior leadership, both civilian and military, why do you talk about amnesty as it was used in cases where raw criminality was not the single defining feature? In the same light, what would it mean to have a transition with indicted narcos at the head of the military?
First, I'll say something that the Justice Department says in every indictment. An indictment is an allegation. People are entitled to a fair trial. Not everyone who's indicted can be convicted. So we have an independent system of justice. That's first. If there's anybody who's been indicted who thinks, you know, I'm actually innocent, there's a way to prove that. Second, the number of people who've been indicted, as I said before, is small. Third, on the question of amnesty, it's happened in every country. It's happened, as far as I'm aware, in every single country. And, you know, in many of the countries in Latin America, the crimes that had been committed were not financial crimes. They were not taking bribes. They were for massive and horrendous human rights violations. Think of Argentina, just one example. Terrible human rights violations. Lots of disappearances and killings and torture. How can you let such people engage in it? Well, in every country, it has happened. And I think, well, let me put it this way. Every Venezuelan opposition figure I've talked to has said that some form of transitional justice is going to have to be negotiated.
Here's a question from Andres Hernandez. Secretary of State Pompeo just announced sanctions against the captains of the Iranian ships that delivered gasoline to Venezuela. Is it an example to be made so other captains are deterred from shipping to Venezuela?
Yes, exactly. We've sanctioned ship owners. We've sanctioned insurance companies. We've sanctioned ship captains. We want to make sure the entire global shipping community knows, stay away from the Iran-Venezuela trade or you're going to be in big trouble.
Okay, here are two questions which sort of overlap. First from Miriam Kornblith. How important is the detention of Alex Saab in Cabo Verde and his potential extradition? And then from Daniel Urdaneta, What are the odds on getting Alex Saab extradited from Cape Verde to the US within the next 2 to 3 months?
Well, the timetable is, going to depend on the courts in.
Frozen again.
We keep trying. Are we back now?
You're back. You'll have to repeat the whole.
Are we back now?
Yes.
Are we back now?
You're back. No, you're not.
Are we back now, Mike? Are we back now?
Yes, you're
How about now?
Back.
How about now?
Yes.
How about now?
Yes.
Are we back at this point?
You are back, audio, but not visual. You can go ahead and talk. No, you're gone. My understanding is that Elliot is going to relink himself. I suppose one day when the pandemic is over, we'll learn all about what happened with.
Are we back? Are we back?
You are back. You are back.
All right. I'm learning a lot about Cabo Verde, and it has a completely independent judiciary, and they will decide. The procedures here. Mr. Saab will have various opportunities to be heard in court and to appeal. But we have a good deal of confidence that we will be able to extradite him. I think it is quite important because he's a key figure in the regime's relationship with Turkey. He's a key figure in the regime's relationship with Iran. He's a key financial figure for Maduro personally and for the regime. He has an enormous amount of information. And we indicted him, as you know, in July of 2019. And we think those charges will hold up. When he comes to the US, he gets a fair trial. And we are confident those charges will hold up in court. So I really do think it's very important. And I think it's giving Maduro a number of sleepless nights.
Okay, here's a question from an anonymous attendee. You are focusing on oil revenues. What about illegal activities which are much more lucrative and under the radar? Drugs, uranium, gold, etc.
Yes, we do focus. It was quite right, but we do focus on those too. As you know, there have been some military exercises by the United States in the Caribbean in the last couple of months. And the goal there is to diminish the flow of narcotics. And that, of course, diminishes the flow of income to those who are trafficking and diminishes the flow of income to corrupt officials in Venezuela who are benefiting. So we are doing that. We're also working on the gold question. And Juan Guaido used a very good phrase, blood gold. And we are trying to and we have successfully intervened with a number of countries in Africa and in the Middle East who over the past year or so were seeing a flow of gold, and we've asked them to stop it, and it's worked. Most recently, Maduro has moved this flow to Turkey and then to Iran, but we keep following up and trying to prevent these activities. And I think it's working.
From Benjamin Ramsey, where does the scenario of an election that doesn't meet international standards, which is boycotted by the main opposition parties, leave the interim administration of Juan Guaido? Is there an accepted legal basis for continuity? Are there concerns that the opposition is not united around such a strategy?
Well, I think the answer is this just happened, and the opposition is actually talking with their lawyers and with professors of law in Venezuela to determine what path they want to take, assuming that there is no free and fair election, that there is a phony parliamentary election in December. What are the legal implications? I don't want to speak for them. I think they'll have a reasonably united position, but they are actually having lots of meetings right now to determine what they think the path should be. And I've had some of those discussions as well with Venezuelan lawyers. What does the Venezuelan constitution say, and what has Venezuelan practice been in the past?
From Mia Dahl, who do you think are the key actors in the international community that need to be mobilized in order to end the Maduro regime? Do you see any opportunities that any actors will change their position?
Well, first, we would like to see, and we will try to have more activity within the Rio Treaty. We'd like to see more activity on the part of the Europeans. To some extent, Europe resort area for figures and their families. A number of them have wives, children, mistresses, mansions in Europe, bank accounts, and we'd like to see the Europeans put an end to that. We don't hold out too much hope for the Russians. Obviously, that would be a significant matter if Russia changed its policy with respect to Maduro. I don't think the Russians are in love with Maduro. I don't think they have a very high regard for Maduro. In my conversations with the Russians and Chinese, that is the impression I've formed. But they are quite supportive. And as you and I and your colleagues are speaking, the Maduro foreign minister, Ariasa, is in Moscow. But that would be a significant change if it ever happened. I'm not an optimist about it happening. I am an optimist about Europe taking, and Latin American democracies taking a harder line toward the regime.
Can you give us an update on the status of negotiations? Anything on the horizon you can talk about? Are there Norwegians active? Anyone else? This is a question from Keith Mines. The Norwegians are ready to re-engage at the point at which they think that it's reasonable, sensible, realistic. You know, they don't want to waste their time either. But if they form the conclusion at any point, okay, it's worth a try now, they'd certainly be willing to do that. I think the problem is, of course, if you look at the behavior of the regime, there isn't any reason today to reach that conclusion, not after they've made the move they have on the Elections Commission and on taking over parties. So it does not look to me like that's something that's going to happen in the very near future. The question is really an assessment of whether the regime is serious. You know, in previous rounds, in the last few years, in Barbados last summer, they've not been serious because they've not been willing to really put on the table the possibility of Maduro leaving power peacefully. If they're not willing to do that, then what are we negotiating about? From Colette Capriles, is there some possibility of using sanctions to resume negotiations toward a plan for transition with a longer time frame?
Well, we believe that the sanctions are a very important incentive for Maduro to go to the table. I say that because whenever there is any discussion of negotiations, whether it's an international negotiation or it's the Norwegians again, or there are discrete contacts between the regime and the opposition, what do they want to talk about? Sanctions relief. So I think the sanctions remain maybe the key incentive. But, you know, is there a possibility of a longer time frame? Let's remember who are the parties in a negotiation. They're really the regime and the democratic opposition and civil society more broadly. It's a Venezuelan negotiation. Yes, the United States can help, the Norwegians can help, many other countries can help too. Others have tried in the past, Dominican Republic, for example. The Vatican tried in the past. And all of us would like to help, but it's fundamentally a Venezuelan negotiation. The problem with the longer time frame, of course, is that you'd be saying to Venezuelans, we've decided that you need to live under a dictatorship for a longer time. We've decided you won't be able to have a free election for a longer time. That's not anything that we can do. This has to be a Venezuelan-led process.
Okay, this next question from Alfonso is very long. I'm not going to read it because we only have about 15 minutes left. And I read it because we believe in freedom of speech, and you might as well listen to this. You two guys, one a heavier weight than the other, cannot disassociate from your own ghosts as Cold War warriors. Todo vale operatives when it comes to sustain USA uber alles, and it goes on in that same vein.
Well, as to having been a Cold Warrior, I'm happy to say absolutely right. I think the Cold War was a war for freedom against communism, and the Democratic side was victorious. I think, what is the relevance of that to this case of Venezuela? I think there's one thing worth pointing out. Among the people we fought in the Cold War were the FMLN in El Salvador and the FSLN in Nicaragua. What happened when the FMLN formed a party and won an election? What happened when Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas won an election? Free election. The United States said, congratulations. And in both cases, we continue to give foreign aid. And my message, which I've given now for a year and a half to Chavistas in Venezuela is, just win a free election. Our framework makes it clear that we want their participation in a democratic transition and in a free election in Venezuela. And we will be bound by the outcome of a free election there as elsewhere. But they don't have a divine right to rule. They didn't inherit the right to rule from Hugo Chavez or anyone else. There've got to be free elections.
Okay, here's one from Bob Stebbings, who is a former president of the Venezuelan American Association. Is there any role for Duque which he might be willing to assume?
Well, Colombia has a huge role to play here first, because 2 million Venezuelans live in Colombia. And I want to salute the way Colombia has tried to receive them and has treated Venezuelans. It's really quite extraordinary. And there are more Venezuelans there than in any other country outside Venezuela. Secondly, of course, there's a long border. Thirdly, they have, in theory, an interest in stopping drug trafficking and terrorism, although the Maduro regime has not been interested in stopping the ELN, the FARC, or drug trafficking. If Colombia has played a role in Latin American efforts to restore democracy to Venezuela, I think in a negotiation, it's probable that a country that is further away, like Norway or Sweden, would be the convener of negotiations. But Colombia has shown that it is really dedicated to the restoration of democracy in Venezuela and to helping the Venezuelan people.
Okay, here's one from Martin Schubert. Could you talk about the status of Citgo?
Citgo, the company, yes. Because there are 6 Citgo executives in jail in Venezuela under terrible conditions, and we're very concerned about their fate. Citgo, the company, was, PDVSA in the United States, outside of Venezuela, and Citgo are controlled by the board, which has been appointed by the interim government. Citgo exists as an independent company and is happily and profitably serving American citizens. There are many, many lawsuits because creditors of the government of Venezuela, and there are many because of the nationalizations conducted by primarily Chavez. And many of them have gotten arbitrators or court decrees saying they're owed the money for the nationalization. And they're trying to get it by forcing a sale of Citgo. Those cases are in court. I think the first one at the top of the list is in court in the middle of July. Meanwhile, OFAC, Treasury, has imposed sanctions which say that, as I understand them, the shares of Citgo, while the sanctions exist, cannot be sold. So we'll see what the courts make of that in July, but our view, the Treasury view, is that Citgo is protected from sale while those sanctions exist.
From Jesus Antonio Aveledo. Good morning. Thank you for this wonderful conference. May it be possible to have the recording of the conference for the members of the directory of the Venezuelan American Chamber of Commerce of the United States? Let me answer that one. Because the standard is not for attribution, we would have to wait to see whether the State Department at one point in the future, and we cannot predict, might make this available. We are recording it, but we will lock it up carefully somewhere. Let's see. I'm looking for, okay. Anonymous attendee, why drag this out with unpredictable timetable by using sanctions? Why not just invade and restore democracy through a well-coordinated coalition?
The use of force is always a last resort. Could the United States do it? Sure. We have the forces to do it, and that's the meaning of the phrase, all options are on the table. Any president would always have that option. But if you think that through, Venezuela is a large country, probably 30 million people living in it at this point. And that is not something to be undertaken at all lightly. We still view it as a last resort.
From an anonymous attendee, Venezuela is clearly a geopolitical pawn. Should we be negotiating with Maduro, or should the real negotiation be with Putin, Xi Jinping, Castro? Why would they be willing to let go of Venezuela?
Well, on the Cuban question, I think Canadians and others have found out why not negotiate with Raul Castro, because for Raul Castro, this is non-negotiable for ideological reasons. Negotiating with Russia, well, we do talk to Russia. I mean, I've met with the Russians. We do have conversations with the Russians. But we are not willing to allow the Russians to determine the fate of Venezuela. So we will continue this policy of pressure on the regime, and we'll continue trying to explain to the Russians, look, what Guaido has said to the Russians, and the National Assembly has said, they're not opposed to there being a Russian commercial presence in the future of Venezuela. It's not their goal to throw out every Russian and exclude every Russian investment. They want all foreign investors to be treated fairly. But the Russians obviously, look, what is this for them? They have a foothold on the mainland of South America. They have a way to sort of stick their noses into our affairs in this hemisphere. I think it's for them really quite a low-cost way of making trouble. Last year, Russia took $1.8 billion out of Venezuela in repayments to Rosneft. At this point, the debt is owed to Russia is way, way down. So I think, the Russians are happy with the current situation, but we continue to talk to them and make the point that their long-term interests would be better served by a Venezuela that we make it to the Chinese too, that is stable and prosperous.
From an anonymous attendee, what is the U.S. position on the role of former FARC and ELN forces controlling territory in Venezuela and what planning is being made to neutralize them under a transitional government? Any comments on the recent rewards offered for FARC's Santrich and Ivan Marquez?
Obviously, the presence of the FARC and ELN in Venezuela is a violation of Venezuelan law and Colombian law and international law. It is support for terrorism. I don't have any illusions about the difficulty of getting rid of them. If Maduro stepped down tomorrow and we had a coalition government moving toward free elections and democracy, what we would do is work with the Venezuelan security forces and Colombian security forces and try to come up with a program that would drive the FARC and ELN out. It would not happen overnight because they are well armed, but this would be absolutely a prime objective for the United States under a transitional regime and then under a democratic government in Venezuela to end the current regime's support for terrorism and support for drug trafficking. That is a top objective of the US.
We have several questions on that subject of if there is a change of president in the US, will there be continuity with the same pressure process to get rid of the regime?
I'm really optimistic about that. And I would say whatever happens in the elections, and also, of course, we're talking about control of the House and control of the Senate, both parties in both houses have stated firmly their opposition to the Maduro regime and their support for democracy in Venezuela and for Juan Guaido. This has not been a matter of controversy. You go back to the State of the Union with everybody rising and applauding. So I do not think that our Venezuela policy really depends on what happens on November 3rd. This is a democratic country. This is a country that supports democracy throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and we're going to support it next year as well.
Okay, one final question from an anonymous attendee. What is the US doing to ensure that all Venezuelans can get refugee status and to protect them in the midst of the humanitarian crisis?
This has been an issue of great concern, particularly in those districts and states where the greatest number of Venezuelans live. And it's been caught up in the broader and very contentious debate about immigration policy in the United States. What I can say is this: Venezuelans who are in this country are not being deported except if they engage in criminal activity. And by that, I don't mean immigration violations. So people have not been being sent back to Venezuela for all sorts of reasons, including the pandemic and the practical difficulties you would have if you wanted to do that. So that's the positive side of it. But the ultimate legal question of their permanent status has not been resolved, may not even be resolved this year, maybe something that Congress has to take up again.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. This has been great. Even those of us who think we know about Venezuela and what's going on right now have learned quite a bit today. And I think you know, and you should know, that the Venezuelan American Association of the U.S. stands with this policy, stands with you, and we will be doing whatever we can to help. Thanks also to our hardworking association's team for making this event possible. Deputy Director Lena Delgado, Executive Secretary Linda Calvet, Program Officer Lori Dominguez, and Associate Lisa Marie Wills. We especially thank Lori and Lisa for taking charge of the online logistics for this program so capably. Our next program on Venezuela's escalating humanitarian crisis due to COVID-19 will take place on July 7th in conjunction with the Simon Bolivar Foundation. The panelists are Marcia Biggs, PBS correspondent, and Cynthia Arnson from the Wilson Center. And the moderator is our president, Ana Julia Qatar. You will receive further details soon. And if you are not already a member of the Venezuelan American Association and are interested in joining, please contact our team via the invitation. Thank you all for participating. Elliot, thank you again.
Thanks, Mike.
We look forward to meeting with all of you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.